Today, we're really excited to be joined by Dr. Patrick Camangian. He's an associate professor in the Teacher Education Department at the University of San Francisco, and he has been an English teacher since 1999. Dr. Patrick Camangian, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you.
Okay, cool. Me too. So can you start by telling us a little more about what is important to know about you and about the work you've been doing in education and social justice?
I've been in education since 1997, starting as a paraeducator or teacher assistant with the LA Unified School District, and then an after-school coach. And then in 1999, I started my career as an English teacher and continued to teach English even as a university professor in teacher education at the University of San Francisco. My commitment to educational justice work is also done beyond the sort of paid hours of my work. So I'm a faculty affiliate with the Institute for Sustainable Economic, Educational, and Environmental Design in Oakland. I'm also the director for teacher development with the Teaching Excellence Network. And I am a founding member of an organization called People's Education Movement in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area. And we do work trying to advance an anti-colonial paradigm for a humanizing education for varying communities.
All right. Very impressive. So that is a good lead-in to what we want to focus on today, which is the conflicting paradigms that we hear about the purposes of education and the competing agendas about how to reform it, transform it, change it. On the one end of the spectrum, we hear a dominant narrative, a corporate education agenda that is backed by government policy, wealthy funders, and it basically is promoting things like standardized testing and curriculum, school privatization, union busting, attacks on ethnic studies, a lot of things that we'll be talking about in this series. And on the other end of the spectrum is this growing resistance and budding movement for a humanizing, culturally relevant social justice education. So I want to start by taking a dive into the underlying purposes and paradigms of the corporate education agenda. And I was reading an article you wrote in Monthly Review called Subverting the Master Syllabus, which I would recommend to all of our listeners as must reading for anyone who wants to understand education through an anti-colonial lens. And I want to just read a little quote from it and then have you help us understand it better. So you said, education policies like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top assume that what is being offered in schools is worth taking seriously, worth racing towards, and not away from. However, policies like these, much like those of colonialists, aim at dispossession and dislocation. They seek the social control of young people through a form of cultural terrorism of the mind. That is strong language. Tell us more about how you see the corporate-backed education policies as colonial-type policies.
Wow. Yeah, I did write that, and there's a lot going on there. And so to answer your question, we'll probably take some time, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot. I think I'm going to go ahead and begin by answering that question by citing a nationalist Filipino scholar named Renato Constantino, who wrote a book called The Making of a Filipino, and who also wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Filipino. Actually, I think it was a chapter or a book, clearly citing or alluding to Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. In Miseducation of the Filipino, Renato Constantino said, the most effective means of subjugating a people is by capturing their minds, which echoes a lot of what Steve Biko said when he said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. And so both of those essentially point to the fact that the most effective means of controlling a population is to control how they think, right? So, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels talked about the different ways that the ways we think, or what they refer to as our consciousness, is shaped by the material and social conditions of our lives. So a lot of the social conditions of our lives are actually based on the material conditions of our life, or our access to resources. So if we think about this historically, and we think about how history is present in the moment, and we think about the fact that we're on of Native American land, and that we exist as settlers. So we exist as settlers in large part because we have the privilege of ignoring the fact that Native people still exist, And we sort of champion our presence here by saying something to the effect of like 97% of the native population is gone forever, and so if they're gone, then it's okay for us sort of be here. But the reality is, the history of native genocide and the enslavement of African people is the sort of genesis of this sort of country that we live in, right? And so the establishing of this country also came with an educational agenda that didn't begin with teachers, and it didn't begin in schools, right? This educational agenda came in the form of soldiers, and came in the form of the military, and came in the form of genocide, where populations just throughout the world, and populations here were decimated and then domesticated. And so we are essentially provided an education, or imposed an education, that hides the fact that history is present in the moment. And so we don't even understand why different people are suffering. And if we, understand, that a lot of communities of color here and abroad are essentially hungry and essentially existing through poverty as a result of our relationship to colonialism, then we understand that the solution to a lot of our problems is the end of colonialism, and to redistribute the power and redistribute resources, re-indigenize or so much of what's been lost from our identities and from our civilizations. When I think about education in the context of the U.S. through compulsory education, then it's a really colonial, hegemonic education that is disseminated to the masses. So essentially, with policies like No Child Left Behind of 2001 and the evolution into Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind essentially sought to achieve what they called 100% competency in reading and math. And they were going to do this through what they referred to as highly qualified teachers. And highly qualified teachers had three criteria. Highly qualified teachers had bachelor's degrees, either passed a subject area exam or majored in a subject area that they were seeking to teach in. And then three, they had a teaching credential. So when you think about historically dispossessed, historically brilliant communities who have been alienated from resources that are inherently theirs, the type of teacher we are defining as highly qualified for them is essentially going to be different than what we might consider a highly qualified teacher in more traditionally successful school context. I actually disagree with that. I actually think a highly qualified teacher is one that stands for justice, that's anti-oppressive, and that's about the humanization of all people. But even if we use the definition of the policy, then the type of highly qualified teacher that we're providing in so-called urban communities have to have different qualifications than the type of teachers that are successful at more suburban, white, and wealthier schools. Because these types of teachers need to be able to connect with young people who have been alienated from schools that don't reflect their needs, that aren't grounded in the needs of the community, that don't provide them with an education that helps them disrupt dehumanization as it exists in their everyday lives, and doesn't prepare them with the critical thinking, the social compassion, or the leadership skills necessary to transform unjust social conditions. So right there, when we think about highly qualified teachers in the context of the No Child Left Behind policy, what we do see is that they're leaving a lot of the political inclinations necessary to be community responsive teachers in so-called urban communities behind. We're leaving their political inclinations behind, the necessary political inclinations behind. So what No Child Left Behind did was create this policy where a centralized government, the sort of federal government, D.C., determined for the different state capitals the type of education that needed to be implemented at the local level. So there emerged what they call the state learning standards. And from the state learning standards, you had, sort of standards-based curriculum. And then you had textbooks that were aligned with state standards. And so we had a one-size-fits-all, Eurocentric, heteropatriarchal, homophobic, essentially colonial hegemonic curriculum that was being normalized as the type of education or miseducation that was going to be used to determine the intelligence of children in the communities that this miseducation was going to be implemented in. And then the evolution of the standardized test that was supposed to be aligned with these state-aligned textbooks was the sort of value-added measures. Value-added measures, and I know a lot of the work done by Dolores Calderon at the University of Utah talks a lot about the problematics of the value-added measures. And what value-added measures is that students come into a classroom with this sort of value based on their prior year's standardized test score. And so a teacher is determined to add value to a student or deduct value from a student based on whether or not students do better based on their prior year's test scores or do worse compared to their prior year's test scores. And so there was a time when teachers were being shamed in newspapers when their sort of test scores, the sort of average test scores for their students were being published in newspapers in New York and in Los Angeles. And so the evolution of that into race to the top started happening when schools started becoming accountable to whether or not they were helping students move towards this competency. It wasn't even a competency. It's like they operate in terms of a mean, right? So now teachers, there's all this talk about merit-based pay. And, now you had all these schools that were being closed based on their so-called poor test scores. The rationale behind closing those schools was because those schools weren't achieving the test scores that, they were expected to get. And so, teachers are losing jobs, schools are being closed, they're being like what they call reconstituted. Teachers are fired, they're having to reapply for jobs. In many instances, then those public schools are actually being turned into private charter schools. And then, the charter schools aren't required to serve every student. It's sort of a market approach to education. And if you, don't like what this school is serving, then you don't actually have to come to this school. So that is one of the many ways that schools or these policies are used to dispossess children of an access to an education that is supposed to be public, that has become privatized, and are actually seen as being connected. If you look at the work of Pauline Littman and David Stovall out of the University of Illinois, Chicago, you'll see that the rise in charter schools is tied to the efforts of gentrifying communities. So a lot of the communities in Chicago that are being displaced are seeing new schools being built, realizing that those schools weren't meant to educate them, that those schools were being built with the intention of building the community to follow. And so, there's the similarity of being dispossessed of our land and our resources historically and globally, and then even today, just being displaced from a lot of the communities that folks are coming from, and this being dispossessed of schools that are meant to serve the children in the communities that they were built in.
Wow, thank you for that. That was a really, really powerful overview. And I want to pick up on where you were talking about how the curriculum today really is like an expression of a whole history of colonial domination in this country. And one of the things you hear a lot about today is discussion about the Common Core, which is the latest version of the standards. Some people, even some progressive educators, say, well, this is actually a step forward because it encourages more critical thinking. Other people say, actually, it's just a way for the testing companies to get a nationally standardized set of standards that then they can make a lot of money off of tests and textbooks and all that. So what do you think about Common Core? Is that, from a social justice perspective, is that a step forward, a step backwards, or more the same?
Well, I mean, from my social justice perspective, I have no problem with standards. I think we should have high standards for all children to really be educated through a genuine humanizing education. And the problem with policy-driven miseducation is that the standards are actually too low. And so there was a shift between state learning standards and the Common Core standards, and that the state learning standards focused on content. A lot of it was based on content. So the Common Core has focused much more on, skill. But still, when you look at Common Core, it's still missing a lot of the essential skills necessary to create a critical democracy. It's still missing the kind of skills necessary to help educate young people on how history is present in the moment. It still under-narrates how young people could heal from a lot of the self-hate that comes from their cultures being excluded from the curriculums that are being imposed on them. So it doesn't talk about the skill of developing a knowledge of self. It doesn't talk about the skill of developing self-love. A lot of the skills that are being implemented in the Common Core doesn't help communities deal with the fragmentation that comes as a result of living under an oppressive society. So, we don't know how to go from divide and conquer to solidarity. We don't develop the skill of political and ideological clarity. We don't develop the skill of what Angela Valenzuela calls authentic caring, where, students are building a connection with each other, where teachers are building connections with their students, where teachers are building a connection between their classroom and the communities that they teach in. And the skill that's not also being developed is we're not developing a common purpose towards humanizing a society that has sort of normalized dehumanization. So the Common Core doesn't also provide us the codification to talk about the different ways that, we practice what Paulo Freire has referred to as sub-oppression in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where the sub-oppression for oppressed people means modeling the humanity of the oppressor as our versions of success. So, being human means modeling the humanity or inhumanity of our oppressor. So we haven't learned about how to move from having a model of sub-oppression as our notion of success and moving towards self-determination, where we get to define our own destiny in our own interest. So while I could see why many will argue that Common Core is a lot better than state learning standards, Common Core is still not a policy that is providing all communities the opportunity to develop, use, and learn through a curriculum or an education that's made in our own image and used in our own interest.
Very well said. Let's make that shift. If the model of success for No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top is, as you're calling, a sub-oppression kind of model of success, that means you make it within the system on the system's terms and maybe perhaps ultimately become a part of that system or perpetuate oppression in some way. So what is a social justice perspective on what the real purpose is of education should be about? I mean, you've addressed some of that, but maybe just pull that together a little more concisely for us. Like, if we were to really transform the public education system, what would the purpose of education be from a social justice perspective? And what would success look like?
I think first and foremost, social justice education wouldn't be centralized. It would be context specific and community responsive. So the type of social justice education that existed in, let's just say, South Central Los Angeles would look different than the type of social justice education that was going to be used in, East Oakland. And the type of social justice education in South Central Los Angeles and East Oakland is going to be different than the type of social justice education that was going to be used in Anchorage, Alaska, or wherever, right? So first and foremost, I think social justice education has to be community responsive. And it would take on a life of its own based on the articulated needs of the community that the education is based in. And in no way, shape, or form am I saying that a social justice education would undervalue reading, writing, math, science, the arts, or social studies. In fact, social justice education, the way I understand it and the way the research suggests, shows that the only way you get high levels of so-called achievement and high levels of fluency and literacy in those aforementioned areas is when the education you're providing historically underserved students is humanizing. Unless the education that we're providing historically underserved communities is humanizing, then we're not going to achieve the high levels of achievement that we seek to offer communities. But I do think for a social justice education to take place, it must consist of these three shifts. It must take communities or children to move from, self-hate to knowledge of self. It must move communities from having internalized divide and conquer to practicing forms of solidarity. And it must provide opportunities for communities to unlearn sub-oppression in order to embody and manifest self-determination. And so I'll keep it short in that way.
Okay. Let's break each of those three down a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So you said the first one was to move from self-hate to knowing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what might be helpful to people is if we can also give some examples of what that actually might look like,
Mm-hmm.
sound like, feel
Mm-hmm.
like. So if
Mm-hmm.
I was to walk into a classroom
Mm-hmm.
where a teacher was practicing that kind of curriculum, what might I see or
Mm-hmm.
hear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with the intensification of scripted curriculum and corporate textbooks, what we have seen is that we haven't treated children or young people as the subjects of their own studies. We haven't used young people's lives as a starting place of all learning. That what has been done is these textbooks or teachers have come trained wherever they were trained from, assuming that what children and communities have to offer to the learning isn't valuable to the education of the communities that they're actually doing the teaching in. That what's actually important are the values, beliefs, expectations, attitudes, and ideologies of the teachers and of the curriculum that's being brought to them. And so, it's in a lot of ways, it's very Kipling, Rudyard Kipling.
Rudyard Kipling? Huh?
Yep, Rudyard Kipling, like white man's burden-esque, right? That here are these communities are as sort of savages or whatever, right? Whatever the code is for these communities nowadays, that they don't, that here as a teacher, a university educated, I come from success. These textbooks have helped me get to where I am today. And so I have an abundance of knowledge. I have abundance of culture. I have abundance of experience that you, poor thing, don't have the opportunity to have had access. So I will bring this knowledge to you. And so, a lot of times that curriculum is Eurocentric. It's, sexist, it's homophobic, and it's hostile. It's culturally hostile. And so these schools and and these classrooms really become hotbeds of social hatred. And young people know deep down in their heart that it's not just irrelevant, but it's at odds with the history and dignity of their humanity. So they engage in what Herb Cole referred to as willed not learning. This desire, this unwillingness to learn from someone who disrespects your dignity. And so what you would see in a classroom that teaches young people to develop a knowledge of self, hopefully in the pursuit of self-love, is that young people can treat their lives and their histories and their cultures and their communities as worthy of intellectual interrogation, as worthy of study, and that their connections could be made between whatever's being read or written in the classroom to the actual communities that children live in. So a lot of the readings that are going to be chosen have to make sure that they're aligned with the experiences of the children that are being taught. And so, and that's not to say that, we can't use writings of someone of a different ethnicity or a different gender of the students learning, but what that will call educators to do is to make sure that the methods we use in instructing that curriculum is aligned with the needs of the children learning it. Because, it's also a false notion. Like, culture is so dynamic. it's not static, but we treat culture as static. So we'll say, me as a Filipino American male, like, somebody who might want to be culturally relevant in a very narrow understanding of the pedagogy, might say, well, in order to connect with this Filipino American male, I'm going to go ahead and put a Filipino American male author in front of him. And then sort of, if he reads it, then he'll automatically engage. And then, by automatically engaging, he'll be able to sort of achieve. But no, like, the experiences of this Filipino American male might not have the similar experiences of me as a Filipino American male in the communities that I grew up in. So there's going to be that cultural, community, historical, regional disconnect. And what will happen is that the teacher won't even be teaching the necessary anti-racist, anti-oppressive skill set that the author of color or the Filipino author wrote with. That the teachers won't even introduce us to the anti-oppressive methods that the author wrote with, so we won't even develop the skills necessary to sort of, disrupt whatever oppression that we're experiencing. I actually missed that point, but essentially, the curriculum that would be created would allow us to feel joy about ourselves, will allow us to bring in the painful past that we have a lot of what a former student of mine, Richie Bennett, called unresolved historical grief into the classroom in order to pave a pathway to a future that is promising. It'll allow us, this type of curriculum will allow us to not simply cry about others, but to cry about ourselves. Will not only allow us to imagine ourselves in the world that already exists, but to allow us to imagine how to create the world we'd like to see with ourselves in it. So essentially, teaching young people knowledge of self allows them to understand who they are, how they became that way, start imagining who they want to be, and essentially start strategizing how they'll become that way.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask a similar question about the other two. Second one you mentioned was, or second element of a social justice paradigm might be moving from divide and conquer to solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
You say a little bit about what we might see there if we were to walk into a classroom.
Mm-hmm. So Jeff Duncan Andrade has really moved some critical educators to look at the different ways that the health sciences could inform culturally relevant teaching. And one of the books that he highlights is written by a child psychologist named Bruce Perry, who wrote a book called A Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And in chapter 2 of A Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a lot of what Bruce Perry talked about was that that children who live through a lot of social stressors have a hyperactive stress drive. So the way I come to understand that is, if a lot of times, children will come into class, and it's not that they're not paying attention to the instruction. It's that physiologically they have a hyperactive stress response system that physiologically forces them to pay attention to factors in the room that could cause them more stress. So when we think about dividing and conquer, we have to look at the different ways that this division is socially constructed. So, you might have one young person who lives on one block, let's just say the 60s, and you have another student who lives in the 70s. And it's only seemingly 10 blocks away, but we've socially constructed a division between us. So, this young person might think to themselves, right? They might have their amygdala might construct this narrative, right? Their limbic system, which is responsible for the fight, flight, or freeze responses to, their senses of fear, might kick in, and we might construct this narrative about someone where we say, hey, he thinks he's tougher than me. He's not tougher than me. or another young person in that class might invest in another social construct and say, oh, she thinks she's cuter than me. She's not cuter than me. Or another person might say, she thinks she's smarter than me. She's not smarter than me. And I mean, sort of all these sort of things that's happening, that's really a defense mechanism to protect our identity in what we imagine to be hostile conditions, and which are in very real ways historically hostile conditions, and that oftentimes go overlooked by teachers. So there's no sense of camaraderie, there's no sense of unity, and there's no sense of solidarity. And so without that tension from the community oftentimes spills into the classroom, the school, and then the tensions that's played out in the school oftentimes spill into the classroom that disrupt a teacher's ability to even miseducate children, much less educate them. So oftentimes when children don't feel like the classroom space is safe and that their safety is not being considered, then, through their willed not learning, will say, will disrupt anything or everything a teacher is trying to teach, because in their minds, a lot of times it's, if you don't care about me, then I don't care about you, and I don't care about the learning of anyone in this classroom. So the divide and conquers is almost ever present, depending on the school that you're in. And even if that doesn't disrupt, if the level of fragmentation doesn't divide the classroom community that exists in front of that teacher, a lot of the community fragmentation exists across the school or in the community. So we have a responsibility as teachers who are interested in notions of social justice. We have teachers who are anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and our responsibility as teachers who are interested in a humanizing education to disrupt that divide and conquer. And a lot of times what is intensifying this divide and conquer is our assumptions about one another. And so everything I've learned about you has informed me through the eyes and lens of my oppressor. So a lot of what I learn about women through sexist ideologies have been taught to me by patriarchal and misogynist narratives, oftentimes imposed on me through corporate music and entertainment industry. And so there's that division. And so if my understanding of you has been informed by the stereotypes imposed on me, then what I need to do to unlearn those stereotypes is to actually learn about you through the narratives, stories, and ideologies about you that I have yet to be exposed with. And so a teacher would create the opportunities for young people to bring in their lived experiences, and then to provide them with readings to help them understand not only the situation that they're in, but how they came into the situation that they're in, that intensifies this division we've socially constructed in our head. And after coming to understand what has divided us, we have to create a method of learning. We have to provide content, and we have to create a purpose that will help us have a common purpose that will politically inform our solidarity, that is necessary for us to engage in any type of justice-oriented lives and work collaboratively moving forward.
All right, nicely said. And you actually addressed both of those, the unlearning oppression as well there. So when you think about the future of education, what makes you most concerned and what makes you most hopeful?
What's really concerning to me is the privatization of public education, right? That's really going to alienate masses of children from accessing an education that will help provide them at the basic level social mobility. And that's just at the basic level, right? And you see in I think Minnesota, I believe that David Stovall talked about, had signed like 100-year contract with Pearson, a corporate textbook company. And so this, sort of privatization of public education and this corporate controlled curriculum in schools is also miseducating the masses. And, it's this idea that, it was Marxist idea. And I don't cite Marx because I'm like a Marxist by any means, but because I also know that people have struggled against colonialism and imperialism long before we were introduced to Karl Marx. But he had an interesting concept when he mentioned when theory grips the masses, it becomes a material force. So when the theories embedded in miseducation are contracted through companies like Pearson for a century, what scares me is the potential of masses of people believing that white is right and that poor people should be blamed for their own suffering. And it's that type of miseducation that this country was founded on. It was first through what Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci referred to as coercive force, and has been reinforced through what he also referred to as hegemonic consent, where the masses of oppressed people become complicit in their own oppression. And so what's scary is that public education is continuing to reinforce the history of lies that have kept people blind to their own humanity and to the dehumanization that this country was founded on and thrives with. What I find most hope in is that wherever there's oppression, and I learned this from a good friend of mine, a teacher at Balboa High School in San Francisco named Art Nelson Concordia, and the way he frames it is, wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. So what's most hopeful is that even though the neoliberal policy-driven reform seems to be driving the educational climate today, that there are pockets of resistance happening across the country on different levels. So you have, teacher education programs across the country that are looking to introduce to educators an anti-oppressive education so that they're more effectively trained to help disrupt the dehumanization that children are experiencing in their school communities. There are also grassroots teacher organizations across the country, one of them being the Teacher Activist Group, whose membership involves the New York Collective of Radical Educators, I believe. It also involves Chicago's Teachers for Social Justice. It involves Boston's Teacher Activist Groups. It involves San Francisco's Teachers for Social Justice. It involves People's Education Movement that are creating this sort of grassroots movement to name neoliberal miseducation as a force that we must challenge. And then there's the efforts of research institutions also across the country that's examining the type of education that's helping young people heal from their unresolved historical grief, their traumatic stress, and their and are helping them more effectively navigate the social reality of their everyday lives. And the work is being done at the Institute for Sustainable Economic, Educational, and Environmental Design to challenge the type of oppression that's being, normalized as something that can't be changed. And then lastly, the work of the Teaching Excellence Network that is looking to disrupt value-added measures, or that's looking to disrupt policy-driven reform. And it's really advancing this model of teachers teaching teachers, where highly effective, socially just teachers are looking to teach other teachers who are looking to engage in socially just education, be more effective in their socially just teaching at their schools. So rather than relying on the professional development of the districts that are accountable to the state, that's accountable to DC, these are people who are taking ownership over their profession to really more effectively disseminate the type of education we know our communities deserve.
Nicely said. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't had a chance to talk about today?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. When I first started teaching in 1999, the notion of socially just education, or even thinking about a pedagogy of the oppressed, was really something that was like a niche. And 14 or 15 years later, I'm beginning to see that the conversation is more widespread. So, it's like Ice-T said, referring to gangs in the movie Colors. He said, "We don't die, we multiply." And I think that's the power of being unapologetic about demanding justice in an unjust world, is that it honors what Huey P. Newton said when he stated that power is the ability to define phenomenon and make the world act accordingly. Like, we are defining the type of education we need in the face of oppression, despite social forces that are suggesting we stay silent in the face of hatred. So there's hope that the corporate agenda for educational reform seems to be intensifying. It seems like there's no end to it. But the reality is we're just getting started and we're already strong. So if in 14 years we have already multiplied the masses of justice-oriented educators, then imagine the type of growth we'll have if we stay true to our commitment to, humanizing education in the face of dehumanization.
There were 1,700 people just a couple of weeks ago at the Teachers for Social Justice conference in San Francisco, and a whole lot of them were under 30 years old. So I think that's just evidence of what you're saying, that's being replicated all over.
Can I just, on
sure.
that note, I like to, I don't know if this is where this will make it, but I know that I like to say that in July, I think July of 2015, the Free Minds, Free People National Biannual Conference will be making its way to Oakland. It started in 2006 in Chicago, went to Houston in 2008, was hosted in Providence in 2010, went back to Chicago in 2012, 2013, I think. I'm sorry, my dates are off, but it will be making its way to the West Coast for the first time, July 2015. And it's a conference that is advancing education for liberation, and that is led by many educators, community-based educators, classroom teachers of color. So it's really looking to really advance this national conversation among educators across different cities to talk about what an education for liberation looks like in different contexts, so that we can inform each other's work locally.
All right. Well, hopefully a lot of our listeners will be joining you there and me there. And Dr. Patrick Camangian, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and for all the great work that you're doing, and for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your inspiration with us today.
Thank you, Ken. I really appreciate the time.